God fully? What does it look like to kind of think through Christmas a little bit differently? And so join us, real excited about that. Now, let's start off. We're going to wrap up the series in Galatians. I hope it's been freeing for you. I hope you've been having a little bit of a shift in understanding grace and how that might apply to your life. And we're wrapping it all up today with what I think is just one of my favorite passages. I believe this is going to be very relevant for all of our lives. I want you to think about this, that most of us want freedom without responsibility. Like, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great to just be free with no responsibility? I don't answer to anyone. No one's going to tell me what to do. Children are like that. Children want to do whatever they want to do, don't they? They often find no is their favorite word. Teens. I've got one teenager and one almost teenager. And it's not so reflective of them, but, I'm around teenagers a lot more, now these days. And teenagers often want to do whatever they want to do, whenever they want to do it, with whomever they want to do it. And sometimes it's not necessarily the people that we want them to do it with. Just responsibility. Just freedom with no responsibility. And just think about sex. Don't think too much about it. But from teenagers, one person told me a long time ago, if you just talk about sex, the end times, or sex in the end times, you can speak to youth groups and have their full attention week after week after week. But not only from teens, but from grandparents. My parents, my mom and my stepdad live in the Villages, which is a wild community, retirement community. I think it's the largest retirement community in the world down in Florida. And they have a massive problem with sexually transmitted diseases. So from teenagers to grandparents, sex without responsibility is rampant, isn't it? Many want to have sex outside of marriage with no consequence. And then just think about money. Boom, 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 boom. That just popped in my mind. Some of you don't get that, but that's okay. This time of a year, we think about this a lot. We hear about it a lot. Just think about the commercials that maybe you saw this morning or in the last 24 hours. You can get all this and you don't have to pay until 5 years from now, or, forego paying for the next 6 months. No money down. Just get whatever you want. You don't even have to pay for it until later. We want freedom, in this case with our money or with sex or with our time or whatever we want to do, but we don't so much like the responsibility that comes with freedom. And of all the people in the world, Christians are the freest. Think about it. We've been talking about this, right? We are free by the grace of God. We are free from having to earn our salvation, from having to earn the opportunity to have a relationship with God, from having to do anything or perform in any way to be accepted by God. We are truly free by the grace of God. However, freedom comes with great responsibility. Once we are set free by the grace of God, we have the responsibility to then apply the gospel. This is a radical concept, but apply the gospel to our lives. And here, we're going to be talking about how it applies to relationships. The Christian life, in fact, is all about what I like to think of 5 gospelized relationships. So let's pick up here the last verse of chapter 5, where we left off last week, where Paul shows how to apply the gospel to the first relationship. And it makes me think of a case study I was doing when I was working on my doctorate. And there was this pastor, and I don't want to give too much of the information, but there's this pastor that I was interviewing. And my first question was, what difference has the gospel had in your church, in the life of the people in your church? And it was a church of several hundred people. It was actually an immigrant church. So he was a pastor, English pastor, English side, in which there were several hundred people. And he laughed out loud. He just laughed out loud. He said, man, honestly, I go in and out of the homes of people and I don't see any evidence of the gospel. So this is really important. So, gospelized relationships. There are 5 of them. And note with me here as we start, the first relationship, of course, is ourselves. The relationship that we have toward ourself or toward our self-image. Paul said in the last verse of chapter 5, since we live by the Spirit, in other words, since Christians, they put their faith in Jesus and the Spirit comes and indwells in them. The Spirit now lives in you. Since you live by the Spirit, let us then keep in step with the Spirit. Let's follow the Spirit. Notice what he says though. Verse 26, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. It's the very first relationship that he talks about. Keep in step with the Spirit, but focus in on yourself so that you don't become conceited. Applying the gospel begins and ends with keeping in step with the Spirit here. And Paul begins to apply it here to ourselves, where we are not to become, or in some cases, to stop being conceited. Well, what does that mean? The word conceit means we become falsely proud. And we've talked endlessly about it over the course of, Paul talks about the law and performance and the difference between either being a religious Pharisee or an amoral, atheist, and how neither is helpful in either way. But we can become falsely proud in either way, leading to prove our worth to ourselves or other people. Whether we think we are better or whether we think we're horrible, we're falsely proud. So when we seem better to others, we feel great. If I'm better than you, if I scored better than you on a test, or I'm in a better position, or I get a better review, or better things happen in my life than in yours, and I feel proud about that, and I'm better than you, I'm conceited in that way. Or when we feel inferior and we feel devastated because something has happened and I feel inferior to you, I'm also falsely proud and I'm conceited. These describe our ungospelized natural self-image. So you are probably, you fall into one of those camps. You tend to see yourself as better, or you tend to see yourself as better. This is our self-image, right? This is how we view ourselves. We either view ourselves as being better or being inferior, and neither is better. By the way, neither is better. This is our natural state. He says, don't become this, provoking and envying each other. These are the two ways that we relate to one another. On one hand, we can provoke those as we look down on them. We feel superior. We want to win. We want to compete. And this is the area that, I tend to lean more in. We look down on the weaker. Like my family, my household is like we compete on everything. How fast can you drink your orange juice? How fast, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I mean, everything's a competition in our house. Like everything. So we tend to be a provoking family. Actually, we were wrestling with what to do, not literally wrestling, but we were trying to decide what we're going to do on Thanksgiving. And traditionally, we go play football with a bunch of people. And now as the kids get older, I brought the kids. And last year, we brought the kids, and it caused a little conflict because you got guys that are 40 and over. And then you got these kids, and the kids are starting to be faster. And so the excuse is, well, we don't want kids that are under 5'5" this year because we're concerned that the old men are going to run into them and there's going to be an injury. But that's not really why, I'm sure. So we're trying to figure out. So then the idea was, well, do I bring my kids to play with these other younger kids? And on their own, I brought this question to my kids. So what do you guys think? Do you guys want to go kind of have your own game off to the side? And they're like, we are way too competitive for that. We can't do that. And I was like, that is a wise idea, because there'd be all these young kids and they're just going to be like running circles around them, or if they're better, then they're going to be upset or whatever. So I said, no, let's just try to get a game going in our neighborhood, with the big kids in our neighborhood, and that'll be good. On the other hand, of provoking is envy, when we feel inferior and we're constantly feeling like we're looking up and we're trying to be something that we're not. Neither is good. Both superiority and inferiority of our self-image is conceit. It's false pride or false humility. However, a gospel self-image is not based on comparisons. Now check this out, the tension between this. It is both bold and humble. And if you're a student of great leadership, you know that the greatest leaders have both. Was Jesus bold? Absolutely. Was Jesus humble? Absolutely. So the greatest leader in the history of the world was both incredibly bold and incredibly humble, and is the perfect example of what a gospelized self-image is. The gospel keeps me humble because I see myself as a sinner purely saved by the grace of God. That's why grace is so essential. If I have to do something to earn my salvation, then I can easily become proud and see myself as being better, because I am in fact better, because I have done more good works than you have. And I can kind of compare myself out and say, well, no, I'm pretty good. I'm a pretty good person. It gives me boldness, though, because I'm loved by the creator of the universe. I'm humble because I'm a sinner that is purely saved by grace. I could not do a thing. But I'm bold because the attention of the creator of the universe is on me. Wow. My identity is as a son. Remember, we went through this whole idea of sonship, so that now the Spirit within me is imploring me to cry out, Abba, my Father. That God, that creator of the universe, is my Father, and I can be bold in my identity and yet humble, because that is only by grace. I was talking to young Dominic this morning, and I like to build people. It's kind of in my nature to just build people up. And so first thing I said, hey, Dominic, what's up, superstar? And he's like, yeah, and I said, man, you just remembered the 3 H's. And we just talk about this all the time in my house. And I talk about it all the time with him too. Remember the 3 H's? What's the first H? And he's like, humble. And I was like, why? Who gave you all that greatness? Because he's pretty great. Amen, Ron? I mean, he's pretty great. He's just natural, like his dad. He's just a natural talent. He really is. He's special. If you haven't watched him play anything, he's special. And I'm just trying to, just as a good uncle, like, who gave you that greatness? And he's like, God made me great. Don't ever forget that. It's okay to see yourself as being great at something, because everyone's great at something. Everybody's great at something. But God made you great. Don't ever think that you just made yourself great. Now, to the degree that I stay in the flesh and in this works-based righteousness is the degree to which I see other people as inferior or superior. To the degree that I'm just in my flesh. And we saw last week that the flesh is at war with the Spirit of God. That's why Paul says here, since we live by the Spirit, keep in step with the Spirit, so that you exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. Apart from the gospel, we will continue to swing back and forth. We see each other as inferior or superior in the flesh. But when we feel either superior or inferior, we must preach the gospel to ourselves, rooting our sense of worth in who we are in relation to Jesus. So let's ask the Spirit to help us apply this truth to our self-image. God, help us to be bold in our identity as sons and daughters, and humble because we know that we are saved only by grace. So the first gospelized relationship is our self-image, how we see ourselves. Now we get into the responsibility we have to apply the gospel to all other relationships. So notice first, and this is a tough one, Paul does not scoot around it. The first relationship outside of ourselves is toward Christians who are caught in sin. 6:1, he says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, restoration, y'all, should restore that person gently. God wants to bring restoration. He is bringing it. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. I love how Paul appeals first as family, brothers and sisters. The gospel levels us into this family. Those who have siblings, and I have 6 of them. And unfortunately, I'm kind of sad. 2 of my sisters aren't going to make it up for Thanksgiving, but I'm going to see my brother and one of my sisters. And man, when you have siblings, it's rarely easy. And we got a sibling. I've already had several conversations this morning about this week and how siblings and family are, well, let's just say, affecting it. It can be very uncomfortable having siblings around, can it? Life can be very uncomfortable. Yeah, I heard that. And it often involves difficult conversations. You just rather not have. I just rather not have. My sister and I talked, my closest in age sister, Elena, she called me 2 weeks ago to talk to me about officiating her wedding next year. And so next October 19th, I'm not going to be here. Real excited. I was talking to my dad and my stepmom yesterday about it. I'm going to see them the day after Thanksgiving. And it's one of those, like, it's exciting, could be slightly awkward, but I'm really excited about it. She's marrying this guy. He is a self-proclaimed cowboy. So that's no insult. He's not a Cowboys fan, by the way, but he's a cowboy. And he said, and my sister's got a little bit of ghetto in her. And he said to me, my goal is to make Elena a ghetto cowgirl. And I was like, man, I like you, man. All right. You got family guy. He's got a solid job and responsible. And I'm like, man, I really like. And he brought up with me. He's like, hey, we want to do premarital counseling with you and all this. I'm like, man, I like you, man. Yeah, this is going to be all right. But we've had a lot of awkward conversations and difficult conversations. Think about the story of Cain and Abel. We talked about this earlier in the year. Genesis chapter 4, the first sibling rivalry. So the fact that you have sibling rivalry is not new. The first sibling rivalry tragically ended with the world's first murder. So don't get any ideas. I mean, I'm not encouraging that as an example, but that is how it went. When the Lord confronted Cain asking, where is your brother Abel? He said that all too famous line that we've all struggled with since. I don't know. Am I? What am I? My brother's keeper or something? I mean, I wonder what his posture was. Like, he probably didn't say it quite like that. I mean, I don't know how he said it, but I don't know is not a good answer to God. Like, God asks you a question, he is not looking for I don't know. He wants an answer. And I don't know, God, what am I? Am I my brother's keeper? The answer is a resounding yes. And for those of us who follow Jesus, who call each other brothers and sisters, the answer is a resounding, we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. Paul shows us how the gospel transforms how we relate to our other brothers and sisters who are caught in sin. Notice he says, those of us who live by the Spirit. It's so important for us to not see this as some class of Christians. This is not some super spiritual elite group that are those special Christians who are spiritual. That's not what he's saying. He's talking about ordinary Christians who live by and keep in step with the Spirit. Who could be less mature in their faith, could be more mature in their faith. But they are simply those brothers and sisters who are in the church who are seeking to live by the Spirit. And some who are younger in the faith may, in fact, be more discerning and more mature in some ways. So he's saying here, we need to be motivated to seek restoration for those who are caught in sin. And we do it, notice, I love this. And this is where I need a lot of admonishment. He says to do it gently. And this is a term that Paul uses for a dislocated bone that needs to be set back in place. Now, I don't know if you've heard the story, but when I was about 14, I did what a lot of 14-year-olds do in their room when they're all alone. I was doing handstands. And back then, they had these TV stands that were metal. There was like a metal TV stand. And there's this big thing, like TVs used to be like really like deep. And, they required a stand, to go on. It's not like that anymore. Now you hang your TV on your wall. Can you imagine 20 years ago, someone like, hey, one day we're going to hang our TVs on our wall. You'd be like, crazy. Things like 500 pounds. But anyway, so it's this metal cart, and I'm doing a handstand, and I fall, and my toe hits the corner, and I'm wearing my $2.50 shoes, by the way, so you can't tell. But I hit it on the corner there, and my toe, it was a compound dislocation, so my toe went out like this, and it was out of the skin. The bone was hanging out of the skin, and my big toe was sideways. And so it kind of hurt, but then I looked down, I'm like, ah! And so anyway, to make the story a little shorter, finally we get to the hospital, and on the way there, my stepdad's driving me there. I'm like, Mike, am I ever going to run again? I'm like thinking about football, and everything. And he's like, you're going to be fine. It's going to be fine. So we get there. And so anyway, now I'm on the table, and the doctor's got, about to grab my toe and said, now look, this is just going to take a minute. And so I was trying to talk, and just like pop, the thing, back in there. It was gentle. I totally just told that. That was like the climax of the story, and I totally messed it up. But it was actually quite gentle. It wasn't, I totally messed that up. But anyway, when we're restoring, see, that's like the natural ed is, let me just pop you back into shape. That's kind of the natural ed. But actually, the way we're supposed to do that is we see that toe, and the doctor's actually quite, knows exactly. It was a woman doctor. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew exactly the angle, everything, and it was perfect. And 5 minutes later, it was good to go. Just sewed up the place where the bone was hanging out, and that hurt a little bit. But so anyway, the point being, we do this not in a way that's judgmental, but we do it in a way that recognizes how weak we are. This is so practical. Paul's talking about watching out for ourselves, recognizing that only by the grace of God, we would be the one that was caught in the sin. We are always aware that we're also weak and in need, and we're just simply being used. I'm going to this brother or sister who's caught in sin, and I'm confronting them in a sense. I'm doing it gently, but I'm recognizing that I've also been one who needed that, and in the future, I'll probably be one who needs that as well. And only by the grace of God, I'm just simply being used by God in this moment. Others are being used by God in other moments in my life, and all of it is just by the grace of God. This does not mean we walk around confronting every sin. It doesn't mean that we just walk around pointing at, it's my responsibility now. Pastor Ed said, I'm just supposed to point out all your faults. And even if I do it gently, hey, I noticed you've been a little pain in the butt recently. Hey, I'm here to restore you. No. Yeah, that would be superior. That would be conceit and vain glory. We're not supposed to do that. So we don't confront every sin. We don't just go around pointing out everyone's faults, but we can't overlook those who are overtaken in sin. So doesn't this necessitate, you're not going to know that just coming in on Sundays. So the fact that we're brothers and sisters, this is why community groups are so important, relationships are so important. We're only going to know if someone is caught in sin if our lives are bumping up enough with one another, right? That's so important. And so that's where it's so dangerous. It's so dangerous because I don't want to get too close, because if I get too close, you may know that I'm caught up in a sin. So this kind of requires that we're in the kind of community where we're trusting one another to kind of disclose what's actually happening in our lives. There are struggles that most of us face that we cannot overcome on our own. This is the brilliance of AA. I came to know Jesus through AA. And it was like, it's an open invitation. So every meeting is, you can go up to, there are different kinds of meetings, but the meeting that I was going to at the time, it was just you go up to the front and you pick up your white chip, and everybody knows that when you take that white chip, this is day one. This is day one of my sobriety journey. And you go around the circle, hey, I'm Ed, I'm alcoholic, glad to be here, it's day one, whatever you say. And there's this built-in humility into that. And everybody knows, everybody recognizes we are all jacked up in here. And you kind of go around like, just jacked up. Man, I remember this guy. I won't mention his name, you would never know him. But man, I just remember thinking, man, I'm struggling, but this dude is whack, man. Like, what is going on with this guy? And I remember I was going to that meeting for like a year and a half, and then I started to get it. And what was really awesome, I say that and it's kind of funny, but what was great about that is that he was like openly all jacked up. Like, just we're in the meeting, and man, let me tell you guys what happened today. I'm probably not, I'm just like the young guy in the, I was 20, and there's a lot of old timers that are like, yeah, whatever, that's just Matt, whatever. Man, just imagine if our community groups were more like that. We were like, man, hey, how's your week? Oh, everything's great. That's kind of we're typically, or, whatever, hanging in there, whatever. But like, imagine if we're like, man, my sin really had a hold of me this week, and I gave into some things. Man, let's lean in together. And there's different comfort levels. We have to be trusting. There has to build enough trust and all that. I understand that. I'm not suggesting that we just bear everything all open, but it's going to take some time. Like our community group, we've been meeting for a couple quarters now, and hopefully as we meet over the course of a couple more, we'll get, and more people hopefully join into that, and we continue to open up and just share our lives. It just becomes more authentic and more open like that. We need brothers and sisters in the church family to lovingly, gently confront and restore us when we're caught in sin. Otherwise, we stay caught in sin. Otherwise, we wouldn't be caught in sin if we could just get out of it. All right, notice the next relationship that the Apostle Paul applies the gospel toward Christians who are weighed down with burdens. So toward self, toward Christians who are caught up in sin, and now towards those who are weighed down with burdens. He says here, verse 2, carry each other's burdens. It's so practical. And in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can place pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. So let's unpack this for a minute. Certainly, restoring those caught in sins is a way to bear some burdens, of course. But it's not the only way. It seems like Paul's making a very practical application to the one command that he said was the fulfillment of everything, the law of Christ, back in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 5. Love your neighbor as yourself. How do you practically love your neighbor as yourself? You help carry burdens. We cannot carry burdens alone. We try. We weren't created, nor are we equipped to do that. What a time to apply this when isolation and loneliness are rampant. Worldwide high. This is not an American problem. It's a worldwide problem. In fact, Pastor Rod mentioned months ago that England now has a minister of loneliness. Not a joke. Listen to this from an article in the New York Times from just last year. Quote, Mark Robinson, the chief officer of Age at UK, Britain's largest charity working with older people, warned that the problem could kill loneliness. Quote, it's proven to be far worse for health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But it can be overcome and needn't be a factor in older people's lives, he said. A former U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review last year, so this is 2016, arguing that loneliness needed addressing in the workplace. It can be associated, he wrote, quote, with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, depression, and anxiety, unquote. Like, do we have a problem in the world? Like, we have a massive problem. This isn't just like the pastor saying it's a problem. This is like global. These are like positions in the cabinet almost. Not quite cabinet, but significant. The answer to isolation and loneliness. I'm not talking about or not acknowledging that there are issues where people maybe need some medication and different things. I'm not trying to oversimplify it. But as a whole, the answer to loneliness and isolation is a united church who takes loving and carrying the burdens of others seriously, right? I mean, I think that's why most of us are here at Restoration Church, to some degree. Notice verse 3, if anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. How easy it is for us to deceive ourselves. This is not meant for us to wallow in our failure. I mean, if you just think about your sin for too long, you will get into dark places. Very dark places. But, so you don't want to do that, but you want to recognize that apart from the grace of God, we are nothing and have nothing. Now that's hard because, especially as an American, we like to but if you work hard, I remember Drew Brees when he broke the record, some of you know what I'm talking about, others don't, but he broke the passing record against the Redskins a couple weeks ago, and he has this moment with his kids on the sideline, and it's all like mic'd up and everything, and he says to his kids right after he broke the record, he's like one of the greatest of all time now, and he says, kids, I told you, you work hard enough for anything, you can accomplish anything. I mean, so inspiring. That moment alone has inspired millions of people probably who are watching that, which was great in one sense. And he is a Christian. He loves the Lord. But apart from the grace of God, no, you can't accomplish anything. Remember Jesus in John 15, he said, apart from me, you can do nothing. Then in verses 4 and 5, Paul explains that we are not all created with the same shape, right? We all have different gifts and temperament and abilities. Thank God. Aren't you glad? We even have different measures of faith that are given to us by God. So we aren't to compare ourselves and to think too highly or lowly of ourselves. But rather we are to carry our own load. Because I'm the only one that is shaped like this, and I'm the only one who is going to give an account to God for what I can do. So therefore, it doesn't make sense for me to compare myself to Tom or Ross or any of us, right? It doesn't make any sense because I'm only responsible to carry my load. See, if I compare myself to someone, let's say cylinders, right? I'm using all these male examples, but anyway, so those are ladies who understand cars have different numbers of cylinders. So big, like, monster vehicles have like engines that have like 8 or 10 or even 12 cylinders. And there are some people that have capacity where they can do a lot. They're like a big muscle car. And so those of us who only have 4 or 6 cylinders, we look at those people and like, wow, they are amazing. No, they're not really amazing. They've just been given greater capacity to do more. Does that make sense? Right? So when I start comparing, if I'm that 10 or 12 cylinder person and I'm looking down at that 8 or 6 or even 4 cylinder person, like I'm better, no, because I'm not responsible for what they're called to do. I'm only going to give an account for the load that I've been given to carry. So this is where it doesn't make sense if I'm the 4 cylinder person to look up and feel inferior. There's no reason for that, because you are only going to have to answer to God for what your load is. You carry your own load. So see, that's where Paul's talking about carry your own load and then compare your actions to yourself. Compare your actions to yourself. We can evaluate how faithful we were with what we have on a daily basis. So for example, at the end of the day, you can just take a moment to silently consider your day. Thank God for His grace in the day and the things that you were able to accomplish, the faith you exercised. Repent of where you fell short and ask God to give you the grace when you wake up to handle what you have on your plate tomorrow. How freeing the gospel is. We're only going to answer for our own load, not the load that God gives someone else. It's so freeing, right? The gospel just frees us from comparing. I hope that's helpful. Each of these could be a different message, but I hope that's helpful as we think about how we have gospelized relationship toward people who are burdened. Now Paul addresses the gospel influence on our relationship toward teachers and the church. He says this in verse 6, "Nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor." And the caveat is, this is hard for me to talk about, and it's hard for preachers to talk about this, but I was preaching to myself this morning like, no, we got to talk about this stuff, because we don't talk about it, then we get dysfunctional. So I'm just going to do my best. This is first and foremost an example of the mutual burden bearing that Paul just talked about. And this kind of principle keeps us from being too individualistically out of balance, when we just pull up our bootstraps and kind of live our own lives, but we actually have interdependence built in, certainly to the church as a family. Paul talked about the church being a body with many parts who have different functions. And here, Paul simply notes the importance of recognizing teachers, not because they're more important. Even teachers submit themselves to others. And I thank God for the teachers that have taught me and continue to teach me. As a matter of fact, I reached out to Pastor Mark Tyndall. He's the pastor at Seneca Creek, who's been more of a Paul to me. And I was like, help. Mark, we need some help. And he blessed us with the angels. Weren't Jennifer and Jonathan amazing this morning? Yeah. I thank God for you guys being here with us. And I thank God for Mark Tyndall, who's been an example of a man who's pastored the church for, over 25 years, I think. Been in one church for 25 years here in Gaithersburg. Man, what a role model he is to me. And I'm submitting myself regularly on a monthly basis to other pastors. And Alfredo's not in here, but I look at Alfredo more and more as a pastor to me. Really. Teachers are by no means superior. However, they usually have a unique position in the church which calls for a unique gospelized relationship. So what did Paul mean when he said, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with an instructor? Most scholars take all good things to refer to financial support. So the majority, if you look up, in commentary, what is he talking about? The majority of them will say, well, this is probably talking about financial support. When those who teach are financially supported and able to do what they do full-time or close to it, it benefits both the learners and the teachers. The teachers are able to exercise their gifts and do what they're shaped to do, and then the learners learn more because they're able to do that in a way that's very focused. Just imagine if you had to do your job with 50% less time. I just look over at Amir, and he's like drowning already. He's like, no way, I would die. Note, This is so cool. This is so cool. I never knew this before. But note that the word for share is the same word for fellowship, koinonia. It's the same word for fellowship. In other words, teachers share, they fellowship the spiritual gifts that they have with the church, and the church shares the financial gifts God has given them with the teachers. We share, we fellowship in that way. It's a pretty awesome word. Now, as you know, all three of the pastors who've worked here work full or part-time jobs to support our families. Pastor Bernard and now Pastor Ron work full-time, busting their butts to make a living. And I have a wedding business, and I do some consulting to supplement along with some outside fundraising, and that outside fundraising is going down and down and down appropriately. In order for me to give what I believe the church needs to teach and serve you well, I do need a greater level of support as we move into 2019. Shared a little bit with you a couple weeks ago, won't get into all that. My desire is to give everything I can possible to this church, to steward it well. And I long for a growing number of people like you. I long for a growing number of people to find restoration and purpose and mission here through our ministry here as a spiritual family where they can find restoration. And I know that most of us are together in that, if not all. So I hope to never cause anyone to feel a guilt trip here at Restoration Church. We do not want to be that church that I hear so many young people, I talk about how they were burned by churches. I don't want to be that church where we end up making decisions where people feel burned or falsely guilt tripped or anything. I'm simply asking you to evaluate what you're able to do and give generously as you're able. We started this pledge system. Next week's the last Sunday, so if you haven't pledged, if you're an owner here at Restoration Church, if you haven't pledged, you have an opportunity to do that for one more week, and then we're going to set our budget next month for the coming year based on that. Man, not just for the pastors though, not just for me, but so that our church can invest more in the community like we did yesterday. We invested significantly in these 30 families that received these Thanksgiving meals. Man, awesome. Awesome. And so let's continue to do more and more as we are able, as we can. Now notice how the next few verses motivates us to do that. Verse 7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please his flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Man, the gardening analogy is so good. Yet so hard, especially in a microwave fast kind of age, right? Instant gratification. But there's no instant growth in the garden, is there? I mean, actually, my stepmom, she actually has this device. It's like this box. It's like a self-contained unit, and it's supposed to be like, it's like this herb garden that's like super gross stuff. I guess that's a thing now. So technology is doing everything to make it, bigger, stronger, faster, all that in terms of even in the garden. But the reality is it takes time to farm. And most of us have no idea what that means, including me. I just know it takes time. Two things are sure about sowing and reaping. Number one, whatever we sow, we reap. You put tomato seeds in the ground, and you don't get bananas, you get tomatoes. So whatever we sow, we reap, and we usually reap more than we sow. And whatever we sow, number two, we will reap. Now, there are times where you put seeds in, and anytime I've done anything like this, I actually don't reap anything. So you can really mess that up. But generally, when you sow seeds, you always reap something. And maybe a big old mess, or some vines, or a bunch of weeds or something, but you always reap. If when we fail to practice gospelized relationships and we sow to the flesh, we reap, here Paul says we reap destruction. Remember the list of the flesh in chapter 5. I mean, all these things: anger, dissension, factions, greed, all these things. There's like 8 examples of relational things. When we don't apply the gospel to our relationships and we're just living in the flesh, we reap those things, those negative things. For those who reject Jesus, ultimately it's destruction of their soul. But even as a Christian, when I choose the flesh, I reap destruction too. I experience the fruit of the flesh. But when we practice gospelized relationships and we sow to the Spirit, we enjoy, or in our house, we enjoy the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. I mean, this is great when we're gospelizing our relationships and knowing our total fulfillment and joy will come beyond this life. Where the Spirit causes things to come to life, sin causes things to fall apart and die. This is a universal principle, but it directly applies to our use of money and how we support not only those who lead us, but how we sow finances into kingdom purposes. I hope that all of you will just spend a little bit less, even if it's just a little bit less than you normally do, on gifts. And starting next week, we're going to have some causes that you can consider. And Living Water International is one of them. I mean, just think about how important water is. Obviously, you can give to local things like manna, and there's other homeless ministries, and we'll give some examples of those. There's some worldwide things. You can sponsor a village with a goat, something like that. You can provide a cow or chickens or something like that. There's all kinds of things you could do. And even if this Christmas, all it is for you is it's kind of a token thing. It's a symbolic thing that, yes, I'm going to take this amount of money I would normally spend in consumerism, and I'm going to give it to some cause. And I hope that you'll do that and experience the blessing of that. You'll never miss anything you give away. Not only did Jesus spend more time talking about money than he did heaven or hell, the Apostle Paul went to great lengths to teach these principles too. So check this out in 2 Corinthians 9. Remember this, Paul said, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously, he will also reap generously. And he's talking about money here, specifically. Each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. This is a passion that God has for the world, the needy. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. So you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Man, the Bible is so relevant. It's so practical to our actual everyday life. I mean, these are promises of God. God is blessing, and He's just, who does God use to bless? He uses people who want to be used as blessings. You want to be a blessing? You want to be generous? God will use the heck out of you. That's a terrible way of saying it. But God uses people who want to be used to be a blessing. And just test Him on this. I mean, He says, test me in this. It's incredible. Remember, it's not the reaping that determines the harvest. It's the sowing. He says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Gardening takes great patience. So I've heard. I'm not patient enough. We don't have a garden. But as we sow to please the Spirit, as we live generously, not growing weary, at the right time there is a harvest. And if you've waited for something, and you've just trusted God and it didn't make sense, but you just waited and you held out. Maybe it was a move or a purchase or a relationship or something where you just said, you know what, I'm just waiting. I'm going to wait on God. You'll never be disappointed. Some of you might be here on the brink of giving up. It's a difficult season for many of you. Remember that sowing to please the Spirit, rather than sowing to please the Spirit, some of you are just grateful to survive another day. And I understand that. But just maybe, keeping yourself tethered to the family of God in gospelized relationships, being reminded that the harvest is coming, will warm your heart and mind to the reality of God and what He is doing behind the scenes. Maybe there's something you can't see. Trust Him. At the proper time, we will reap a harvest. If, Paul says, if we do not, what? Give up. Repeat this after me. I will not give up. By God's grace, I can do it. I know Annie just said, amen. Because we were in college and Dr. Wendell called her. He made us do that as students. I never forgot that. Man, you just say to yourself this week, I am not going to quit. I'm not going to give up. Why? Because by God's grace, I can do it. Now, we've seen these 4 gospel relationships. Hang in there with me. I know this is good. And Pastor Rod and Pastor B, they always tell me, don't tell them, don't tell them. But I know we're going a little bit long here, but hang in there. We're going to feed you. We're going to feed you in just a minute. I know you can smell it. We're going to feed you. We've seen these 4 gospel relationships, right? Self, Christians caught in sin, Christians weighed down with burdens, teachers in the church, and now this final appeal. Last thing he talks about, toward all people. Toward all people. Therefore, as we have opportunity, Paul says, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Man, life-giving worship, sir. I love seeing all your faces here this morning. This is great. Blessing our neighbors, authentic community groups, like all these parts of our strategy, they're very important. But the Christian life is not primarily about these kind of programmatic things, as important as they are. The Christian life is primarily a calling to love our neighbors as ourselves, to do good to the person that God puts in front of us at the time He puts them in front of us, giving them what's best for them. This is like the flight attendant in the airplane who instructs us to place the mask over our mouth first, and then, if the plane's going down, like you're going to think of this, but plane's going down, put the mask over yourself, and then attend to your kids. Well, we take care of our family first. Paul emphasizes that. There's many times in the New Testament where Paul talks about that. He actually says if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever. So family first. And when we think about the church family should be given priority. Like if there's a need in here, we're not meeting it, and we're trying to go reach the world, problem. If we just fed 30 families and you're like, I ain't got no Thanksgiving turkey. Well, you should have spoke up because we asked. But if you're hurting, please let me know because, ain't nobody going hungry here, all right? We are hungry, so we better wrap it up. Yeah, we take care of our family. Yeah, so Jesus said the world will know it. Thank you. The world will know that we are His by our love for one another. As we love one another well, then we can love the world around us well, and we will be the reason why people choose Jesus, because they want to be part of that too. Gospel relationships are the core of the Christian life from the inside out. So who needs your love today? Who needs your love this week? Ask God, just as we close here, ask God in these moments to reveal someone to you. And then by His grace, do whatever He tells you to do. What relationship is it? Is it yourself, your self-image? If you're here and you haven't yet put your faith in Jesus, you haven't crossed that line of faith, I want to pray for you. And I would love for right now to be the moment that you give your life to Jesus. You don't have to stand up or raise your hand or whatever, but I'm going to pray for you in a minute, and I want you to let me know that you've made that decision. Maybe it's another Christian that's caught in sin and you know about that, but you haven't said anything because you've been unwilling to dive into that uncomfortable situation. Maybe today's the day or this week as God prepares you for that. Maybe it's a Christian who's weighed down with burdens that you can help with. Maybe it's a teacher who you can give toward. This feels awkward saying that. And maybe there's some people in your world. Maybe there's some of those all people that God's calling us to love and bless this week, that God's going to put in your life. There's more opportunities in these next 5 weeks than the rest of the year combined. Usually, just watch when you're going out shopping, just slow down, give yourself a little more margin, and just look around you for the people who God's crossing your path with to love. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest. We're going to pray, sing a song, and eat. So let's pray. God, thank you so much for these moments.